All right, thank you. Okay, hello everyone. My name is Cameron, and I'm a researcher here at UNSW's Epicenter. And when I joined Epicenter, I was applying for a job in something called narrative visualization, a phrase I had never heard before. But with my creative writing background and background in narratology, I did know a little bit about narrative, and I figured I knew a little bit about visualization too. So I figured I'd just kind of see what these things kind of meant when they were put together. So this was daunting at first, but what I soon learned is that narrative visualization doesn't really have that much of a solid foundation as to what the narrative is in relation to visualization, at least within the field. Narrative visualization isn't a new field, it's been around for quite some time. But the concept of narrative remains really underdeveloped in many aspects. So what I would like to do is demonstrate a way that we saw forward for narrative visualization by presenting a tool that we've developed at Epicenter for narrative viz, which uses rhetorical structure theory to create a narrative structure purpose-built. So what is NARViz? Well, the field of narrative visualization or data storytelling has really proliferated in recent years within academic communities as a way for data visualizers to more effectively communicate their data. Despite this long history, there really isn't a whole lot in the way of a formal narrative structure for NARViz. And part of that we suggest is that when you start advocating for a formal narrative structure, when you start to try and find one, you do run the risk of running into some of the problems that have kind of plagued narrative and folklore studies in the past. And it seems like the NARViz community at large is trying to kind of avoid those problems. However, while we understand this trepidation, if NARViz practitioners really want to grow the field, we need to recognize that all new mediums will eventually develop their own formal techniques and frameworks. And we've seen this in other genres. We've seen this in film, graphic novels, video games, and what Kai was speaking about before kind of is developing its own sort of narrative structure in a way. You know, they've blossomed their own concepts of storytelling or narrative that don't necessarily fit what's kind of come before. So that's what we're interested in doing. But the first question we have to really ask is why are we using NARViz in the first place? Why adopt this as a strategy for telling our data stories? Well, Brent Dyke seems to suggest that a good reason for this is to try and broaden the people that can get involved with our data, that just presenting our data to a small selection of executives or data analysts doesn't really cut it anymore. And we can see how true this is today with a lot of people being surrounded by data, consuming data, but perhaps not the right data or just not really knowing what to do with it. So we've got this sense of trying to broaden our audience. Stephen Boyd Davies and their team are more interested in historical data, and they suggest that there's perhaps potential to tease out other stories from data sets, experiences, lives, and histories that can otherwise become forgotten. So we have an opportunity here to really increase representation, which is awesome. Now, Carol J. Overby and crew also discuss the possibility of NARViz to help make elements of data a lot more clear and perhaps to demystify data. I think even those of you here who are really hardcore data visualizers can understand that if you're shown data that you don't really understand, or you're on the receiving end of a system that you don't understand, it can be really daunting. So we're demystifying our data here. Now, finally, and this one really resonates with me, Krauss and Rucker suggest that the thing about a story is that it can be very persuasive. So if we sort of allow our data to be mounted onto a story, onto a narrative, we can have a lot more sway. And this is very important when you're trying to make an argument. But like Krauss and Rucker, I actually show some degree of concern over NARViz's power to persuade, because this can easily become problematic. So those are kind of all of the objectives that we want NARViz to reach. And when you go ahead and Google NARViz, you get these very optimistic images. You get things like storybooks brimming with data, or infographics of people doing an Iron Man pose, sort of wielding their pie charts and graphs. I understand that there's always a certain hyperbolic element to these kind of images, and also that most of these come from people trying to sell you on a service or mindset. But I can't help but feel that there's a bit of a disconnect between the way those of us in the NARViz community often view what we do and how we actually manifest that. And I think it's because we've been asking the question, why a narrative's good, and not asking the question of, well, what is a narrative in this context? So like I say, if we're asking this question of what is a narrative, we have to think about what's the kind of narrative we've been transposing onto Navias all this time. Now, there's a lot of different narrative structures out there, as anyone who's taken a course in narrative design or creative writing will know. And yeah, there's a lot. And many of these structures are really developed out of fields such as folklore studies, and they're focused on particular types of stories. So things like Vladimir Prop's folktale formula for Russian folktales, but also things like Ursula Le Guin's carrier bag theory, which is also known as the feminist monomyth. And the reason I bring up Le Guin is because she was really pushing back against another structure, which many of us would be very familiar with, and many of us will have often seen. So what I want to do is just do an experiment here. Just if everyone could either hit the hands up button, let me actually see if I can get my chat window up here. But if everyone could, oh no, it's all gone wrong. There's the chat. Where are my slides? There are my slides. Okay, if everyone could put their hand up or just say something in the chat if they've ever heard of the hero's journey. Okay, no one. Well, oh, yep, here we go. One person. Okay, a few. Yep, now it's coming through. Okay, a few people have heard of it. It's a very common one that a lot of people have heard of. Predominantly, it was really made famous by George Lucas because he was like, hey, I'm using this for Star Wars. And it became a lot more popular from that. But the thing about the hero's journey is the way it's kind of weaved its way into contemporary writing is a little bit problematic, because it was made by Joseph Campbell, and Joseph Campbell never really intended it as a structure for creating narratives. He was more interested in kind of Freudian and Jungian psychology, and he didn't really build on any previous narratological folklore or mythology theory. He wasn't interested in it. So there's all these gaps in his work of kind of the theory that it was sort of engaging with, in a sense, or not engaging with, I should say. Additionally, Campbell's structure is becoming more and more criticized over time for being full of very colonial overtones, for essentially taking a modernist Western view of the world and trying to filter every other culture through that lens. So I could go on and on about Campbell for ages. We could talk about the pros, the cons, or whatever. But the point is that Campbell's monomyth is an example of when we don't decide to create our own narrative structure or apply our own narrative structure, and we just use those that are already around us kind of unconsciously, we can start to get into some kind of murky waters there. So we need to be careful. So it was with this position in mind that we decided to come up with our own narrative structure for narrative visualization. And we actually looked beyond a lot of traditional narrative structures and found RST, rhetorical structure theory. This was first developed as a genre and perhaps language independent taxonomy for breaking down a text structure. And the RST framework provides a methodology for categorizing the elements of a text, not in terms of their story structure, but instead by their relationship to each other. RST suggests that a text is made up of a nucleus, such as a short statement, and satellites, which are other textual elements that relate to the nucleus. Satellites might provide background information and elaboration. They might present an opposing view. And complex texts might have more than one nucleus. They might have, multiple nuclei. So in this image here, which is a little bit hard to interpret, at least to me, we can see there's these different satellites all leading back to the one nucleus. And we have things like background information being in a satellite, evidence being in a satellite, that kind of thing. And these might carry other information like where the data was gathered from, the conditions under which the data was gathered, all that kind of thing. And so what we decided to do was to take this structure, because we thought it was a nice place to start for data viz, because it doesn't have those kind of narratological baggages, and build a tool out of it. So we built our version of RST with our collaborators, Defense Science and Technology Group, into a broader tool called NAVAT, the Narrative Visualization Analytics Toolbox. So this is our RST node editor, where each node refers to sort of one segment of a text. And then you can define the relationships through click and drag commands, which hook the segments up to one another. But then when you double click on a node, you get this box popping up, and you can add in the node's name as well as any narration. You can then click through here to our data viz editor, which gives you this kind of screen here. And our data viz editing tool was actually developed originally by Monash University as the Immersive Analytics Toolkit, which we then used as the base here. And then you can build out your visualizations, which are then, the whole narrative can then be fed through our presenter here, who sort of speaks the narration and recreates the visualizations as we go. The really cool thing about our tool is our narrative length can be altered depending on the circumstance. So I might make a 20-minute presentation, but let's just say I've only got 5 minutes to present it in because something's come up. I can tell my presenter, you've only got 5 minutes, and it will actually prune the nodes based on the relations I've defined. Now, as long as I've structured my narrative correctly, the narrative will still make sense and it will still contain all the most crucial data, but it might miss out some kind of extra things that were just good to know. Okay, so I've had the 1 minute warning, so just wrapping up here. Our Narvat tool, we're about to launch it online for everyone to use. So if you're interested, if you want to check it out, you can head on over to epicenter.matters.today and see. We're not quite launched yet, but we will be very soon. And we're looking for collaborators and we're looking for people interested in making cool data viz stories with us. Thank you very much.